How good is a Iuno as a beginner's first 5-star unit? Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Typically speaking, people don't tend to evaluate how good a character is for beginners unless they're really evidently good for a beginner. I thought that a Iuno would be an interesting one to talk about, considering that she's being made as a more niche unit, and there's gonna be a lot of people that are gonna want to pull her simply because they really like her. This doesn't even just apply to beginners really, but also to people who just haven't invested in any heavy attacker characters whatsoever, and they're wondering what to do. So let's think about this. Is a Iuno a good beginner first 5-star pull? Well, obviously Augusta, who's on banners right now and is before a Iuno, is technically a much better one because she's a main DPS, you're able to pair her with Mortefi, who's a 4-star unit, and then get her hitting the ground running pretty quickly. In fact, the current banners right now are insane for beginner players, because you also have Shorekeeper, who is the de facto best unit in the entire game, still the strongest support around, and Carlotta, another DPS who's really good for beginners, considering her ease of use, ability to be really good on static miss, which is a standard 5-star weapon that's permanently available, and just still being a very strong DPS all around. So, why would anybody pick a Iuno over them? Well, the answer is simple. Simps are a thing. So let's think about this. If you pull for a Iuno as your first 5-star, what's next? Well, the thing is, a Iuno actually has DPS potential. That's right. You don't have to play her as a support if you don't want to. It's highly likely that you're going to be able to play her as a main DPS and have it be competent. Consider that you were able to do the same thing with Brand, and you were able to use Sonhwa as his second salt teammate, a free character. In a Iuno's case, she's an attack scaling unit, so that opens her up to benefiting from attack scaling buffs. That's very good, because most supportive gear in the game right now caters towards attack scaling units. It appears as if heavy attacks are going to be a major focus within her kit. So we actually enter a pretty funny situation here, where instead of pulling a Iuno to replace Mortefi, you still actually want him to use him as a support for your Iuno, and you're actually able to put him on Static Mist, which provides your team with attack, which once again will benefit your DPS Iuno. Now, typically speaking, whenever you want to use a support as a DPS like this, you do want to get their signature weapon. This is because they're obviously not built to be a main DPS, so you have to have their damage be as high as possible to compensate for the fact that their damage numbers aren't going to be quite as high as your average DPS. You generally want to get as much performance as possible out of them. I do think that for a new player, she's definitely going to be able to carry you through the early game. Pretty much any unit can, that's not really a question, but it's obviously not really about the fact that you can, it's more so about the fact, can you make it more comfortable for yourself? And I do think that a Iuno is going to be able to achieve that for you. I think she's probably going to be just fine in TOA. I feel like that's probably going to end up being DPS Iuno's best game mode. We'll have to see how she does in Whimpering Wastes, it's going to depend on her multi-wave. I will say that in wuwa, the meta has been shifting quite a bit, and it does feel like HP counts are definitely rising there. It's not really the simple AoE mobbing mode that it once was, so it's debatable as to whether she's going to be a good DPS there or not. I wouldn't say no, it could definitely happen, but we'll have to see. It's gonna depend on how good her wave clearing is and such. Her Wuthering Waves clearing. Okay, alright, moving on. So, if you're literally starting from zero and you have genuinely nobody to use if you're a Iuno, then yes, you are indeed going to be able to use her as a main DPS, and I do think that she's going to be able to carry you for the most part. It's obviously not going to be as strong as pulling an actual main DPS. However, if you start during a Iuno's banner, you've mostly got a choice between her and Chacona. There's also the fact that whenever you start Wuthering Waves, you're now able to pull any character from 1.x. However, the general consensus is that for the long term, you're gonna want to pull Shorekeeper. You can also go for Camellia, that's also quite a good option, but either way, you're gonna go for one of those two as your first 5-star from that banner. However, this can potentially change if you're really serious about picking up a Iuno and you're starting the game for her, or if you're just someone that really wants her and you're still relatively new and you have access to that banner. Then you can even consider picking up Gion. This is because she is a heavy attack buffer. Her outro skill provides quite a lot of heavy attack damage amplification. This is something that's going to be quite useful for Gion, as he's primarily a heavy attack DPS, and the main meat of his kit comes from that. It should of course be noted that a Iuno does have competition in this regard, because she's going to be running alongside Chacona. Currently, Gion, Chacona, Rover is Gion's best installed team. We're gonna have to see if a Iuno is gonna be able to overtake that. I personally do think that's going to be the case, I will be surprised if not, but at the very least, she's likely to be on par with the Bard. So even if she's not a direct upgrade, she will at least be a side grade. So if you prefer a Iuno as a character, well then you can invest without any worries, and Gion actually ends up being a good first 5-star pick in that aspect. Obviously, I would still recommend picking up Shorekeeper first. You're shooting yourself in the foot if you make a new account and you don't pick Shorekeeper from that banner. But if you've already managed to get her from the currently running banner, or perhaps you just want to get her later on, well then Gion is definitely a good pickup if you want to play Iuno as a support for heavy attackers. With that being said, that's another thing. Who can you actually use her with down the line? And who would actually be a good pull to pick up down the line? I would say that Phoebe is a good pull in general, because she's just so versatile, she can use so many teammates and she's strong in so many situations. Her main flaw is that she's not really good in Whimpering Wastes unless you have Shakona, or unless you're playing her as a confession support for Zoni. However, she ends up being one of the best pulls for TOA in terms of bang for your ass strikes, because you're able to put her with so many characters. Iuno is one of those characters. Phoebe does two main attack types, normal attacks and heavy attacks. Iuno is able to benefit the heavy attacks part. If you're a newer player, I genuinely could not recommend Phoebe enough as a pull. She is so free-to-play friendly, because you're easily able to pair her with Spectre Rover, a character who is literally free, and if you're intent on pulling a Iuno, well then you've got yourself a good support for her already. Not like she doesn't have a multitude of other ones, but it's likely that this is going to end up being one of her better ones. So by doing that, you end up investing in a character where, if you do end up pairing your Moon Lady with someone else over time, you're still going to be left with a very strong free-to-play friendly DPS. This is because, if you need to use your Moon Lady somewhere else, you can easily put Sonhwa or Mortefi in her place, and your Absolution Phoebe is still going to perform very well. She also has quite good cheap weapon options. And if you end up pulling Stringmaster as your beginner limited 5-star weapon from the beginner 1-point dex banners, well then you're sorted, because that's literally only 2% worse than Phoebe's signature as a DPS weapon. And if you haven't chosen that weapon yet, then yes, you do want to get Stringmaster. Trust me on this one, it is an insanely broken rectifier. And we get rectifier characters quite often, so I do recommend it if you haven't done so already. That way, if you end up picking up Phoebe next time she's here, you can then end up picking up Gion later on. That gives you another strong heavy attacker to use your Iuno with. And then your Phoebe can still work independently. If you're somebody that's wondering whether Augusta is a good pickup for you right now, I would say yes, she's also a really good first 5-star to have. Or if you're still building up your account, then she's still just a great pull in general, because of how powerful she is. And obviously, Iuno is going to end up being her best in slot premium support. So if you want to play her in her absolute best team, then yes, it is worth doing so. However, if you absolutely cannot miss out on a Iuno whatsoever and you need her, yet you're feeling a little bit tight on Astrites and you just can't pull for Augusta right now, hence why you're looking for other options, then like I said, it is very viable to just wait for Phoebe or Gion to get reruns down the line. I suggest getting Phoebe first, and then getting Gion. That is generally going to get you the best bang for your Astrites. If you're a completely new player, I would actually steer clear of Zoni for now. She is very expensive investment-wise. Get Phoebe first, and then you can consider getting Zoni. Now, if you started the game for Zoni, don't worry, she does have a free-to-play team. It's just not that good compared to your premium team. However, you're in luck if you're really a big fan of Iuno and you're planning to get her as your first 5-star. The reason I bring up Zoni is because she also primarily deals in heavy attacks, which once again, is the main thing that this lovely Moon Lady deals in. However, the thing is, the Goat Lady has quite a set-in-stone team. What I mean by this is that she really likes to have Phoebe as her second slot teammate. This is because the buffing that the Acolyte provides is absolutely absurd. It's also another reason as to why I recommend Phoebe as a good beginner pull, because not only is she an amazing free-to-play friendly DPS, but if you get interested in Zoni down the line, then she's able to double as a support for an extremely strong Spectral Frazzle DPS. So generally, unless you really want to, steer clear of investing into Zoni until you're able to get yourself a Phoebe. Once again, it's not necessarily a requirement, as you can play a team of Zoni, Iuno, and Spectra Rover. It's just not going to be good as our premium team, which I don't believe is going to feature Iuno unless some interesting rotation is come up with. In terms of how important investing into your weapon is, it's interesting. We're gonna have to wait to see the actual effects of it. However, the situation is this. She's not really going to need it if you're playing her with somebody like Augusta or Phoebe, because those characters still have quite high damage profiles, they're up to standards of 2-point X units, and they're generally not going to need the help as much. So I feel like you would easily be able to get away with not having the SIG, even if it's likely to be a big increase, because in Wuthering Waves, signature weapons tend to be really big increases for their characters, because signature weapons in this game are guaranteed. So they're generally pulled a lot more frequently, but even so, you obviously still need to have priorities and whatnot. However, if you're planning to play her as her own main DPS or with Gion, then you do want it likely because your damage is just going to be lower overall, and in Gion's case, You're playing her with a character whose hypercarry damage is kind of falling off, so her own damage would actually be greatly appreciated in that team. I feel like if you're playing Spectre over Zani, it's appreciated but not necessary, because Spectre over Zani is still a decent team, all things considered. Though once again, I wouldn't deliberately go out of your way to get the Moon Lady for her in particular. If you really want to play Zani, it's Phoebe that you're after. And if you're a newer player, you're going to want to pick up Phoebe anyway, just due to how valuable she is. All roads lead back to the Acolyte, I swear. Kuro, you accidentally made her so freaking strong in the meta, it's insane. I personally don't think that she's a bad beginner 5-star. She's obviously not the most optimal one. You can definitely make her work, and you have avenues to make her work, especially if you're still able to pull Gion from the 1.x beginner banners. However, you do definitely have technically better options. You don't really need to get a Iuno as your first, but I feel like if you're getting her as your first, it's because you really like her. So, live with that information. She is a decent one. Not the best one, but a decent one. Hopefully this video was able to tell you if Iuno is a good beginner first 5-star or not. This has been Juice, signing out, and watch the next 5 releases somehow end up being Phoebe teammates.